heavy-duty industry and transportation. Now, there are, of course, challenges as we look to scale up the hydrogen economy, and I'll just touch on two main challenges. Business models. It is, it's too early to see that clean hydrogen playing a role in everyday energy demand, mainly because when made into fuel, for example, it's more expensive than other fuels. So the exciting news, though, is that we're working together with governments and stakeholders to create those business models and support the regime required to sustain that clean hydrogen market, much of like what we saw in offshore wind as an example 10 years ago. And then the second is technology, and I'm sure we'll get into it. Much of the technology required for low carbon hydrogen is actually used today, but perhaps not at the scale and the overall system optimization that's going to need to be required to really decarbonize those hard to abate sectors. But again, I think we're seeing a lot of great momentum in developing and players coming together to really tackle scaling up that technology for hydrogen. So, overall, I think we're right to be excited about hydrogen and the role it can play to help us to get to net zero. And it was great to see it featured so highly in COP26.
Excellent. Thanks, Louise. And we'll come back to those points you make about business models and about technology, I'm sure, during this discussion. Henrik, do you want to give your view? How optimistic are you about the future role of hydrogen?
No, I'm also very optimistic. And just for your knowledge, so I started my, let's say, a little bit my hydrogen career in early 2000. When we had the first wave of new hydrogen projects coming up, EU was really in the forefront. I was in research, helping in designing some of the first green hydrogen filling stations. I was in fact at the opening in 2003 in Reykjavik, when we opened Europe's first public hydrogen filling station. It was designed by Equinor, at that time Norsk Hydro. And I would say a lot have changed. There was a lot of momentum at that point of time, but it was very focused on one sector only. It was only transport. So it's quite a narrow community. I think today it's much broader, much wider in terms of industry participation, much more alignment between industry and government, how to push forward. So I would say it's definitely changed quite a lot. So today I'm much more, let's say I have a much more comfort that we will achieve hydrogen this time compared to when we were 20 years ago in the early 2000s. So I'm very optimistic about that.
Excellent. So that much broader support, that's really encouraging to hear. And Chris, I take it you share this optimism?
Absolutely, yeah, no, I really do. And I guess the question is it a flash in the pan or is it actually something real and enduring? And I think you've got to come back to fundamentals. And if you do that, there are really only two ways of getting energy from one place to another without emitting CO2 at the point of use. And one is via electricity and electrons, and the other is via a molecule, but it has to be a molecule without carbon. And therefore hydrogen provides that. So there's a real fundamental there. I think the fundamental of the fact that you can store energy at scale, and electricity is one of the most classic just-in-time sort of ways of getting energy from one place to another. You have to use it at exactly that point in time you can store, but at scale, at grid scale, there are costs, whereas a molecule gives you more options. And then I think finally, the fact that you have a fuel that you can use in a very similar way to existing hydrocarbon fuels to get today means that the transition, and I agree with Louise, particularly those industrial aspects and things, you can transition much more straightforwardly than a wholesale change to a new vector. So I think those are the fundamentals. And then, yes, the recognition now is the role it plays across multiple sectors and the need for business models, I think, is lining it up for a much more mature role than maybe 20 years ago it was envisaged to be.
Great sense of optimism there from all three of you. Let's get into the cost issue, though, because green hydrogen's expensive at the moment. And we'll come back to blue in a minute. I haven't forgotten blue, but I want to talk about green first. Henrik, you've been on this journey a long time. How rapidly can the costs of green hydrogen come down, in your view?
Yeah, no, it's this type of crystal ball question. I think everybody is asking themselves, and we are seeing some nice, let's say, curves. I think we almost bombarded that with new cost curves on green hydrogen on almost maybe a weekly basis from different, let's say, institute and research on how it can go. In general, it comes down to some, let's say, very simple fundamentals. And if you look a little bit from Norway, Norway, in fact, in the industrial, let's say, time in Norway was developed around electrolysis, a lot of abandoned hydroelectrical. How do we create value of that? So a lot of the electrolyzers was developed in Norway back in around the Second World War, and that was due to cheap electricity. And I think this is still the driver for a lot of green hydrogen and also blue, the cost of energy, because we are in principle transforming one energy to another energy, from electricity to hydrogen, from gas to hydrogen. And that is the main cost driver. And I think that's the key, let's say, challenge on green hydrogen today, is that cost of electricity is very high, particularly for industrial use. So if you look in EU or UK, price of electricity is about 3 to 4 times higher compared to natural gas. So that's a huge gap just to close that one. Then people are saying, okay, we can, let's say, create a lot of wind farms, we get curtail power, and we can then use that, buy electricity at zero price. But that is another challenge, I would say, because then we are embarking on a disruption in the power market, saying that wind investors will invest in wind farms, knowing that we'll get negative prices. So it's quite a dilemma and a paradox. So there are, I think, some paradox dilemma that needs to be solved, and it relates to basically to electricity cost, not so much on can we get cost on electrolyzer down, can it be cheaper? So it is on the cost of energy. And if you look today, due to this, green hydrogen is probably 3-4 times more expensive than blue hydrogen, or 6-8 times more than the unabated natural gas. And that's a huge gap you need to close. We're talking about maybe abatement costs close to the $600 to $800 per ton in the initial phase, before electricity prices have come down, before electrolyzer costs come down. But the fundamental, again, is electricity prices must come down to a much lower level. And then people say, okay, we can do this in Sahara or in Chile, where you have a lot of cheap renewable, but then you need to transport that to the market. Then you add conversion cost, transport cost, and then you need to convert that back to hydrogen again at the destination. That adds cost. So I think to make green rapidly decrease costs, a lot must happen in the electricity sector, and that can take time. And then again, you need to subsidize that enormously to get the cost of electrolyzer down. So there's quite a gap. So I'm probably not as optimistic as somebody else, but I believe with my heart that at some point in time you will find a crossing point between blue and green, and it will be more cost competitive. But it's more like a timing issue, and you have to have these big, let's say, elements in place before, like electricity.
Okay, so very heavy dependence there on that cost of electricity point. When I was in Glasgow, Lord Adair Turner, who's chair of the Energy Transition Commission, was talking about a cost potentially as low as $1.50 a kilo by 2025. He was very, very optimistic. So, that was sort of 75% maybe reduction on where we are today in the next 5 years or so. Either Louise or Chris want to come in and give us their forecasts for the cost of green hydrogen. Louise, does BP produce a cost forecast? I know you do lots of scenarios, so are there some cost forecasts from BP?
We do produce various scenarios, and much like Henrik said, is depending on the week, it'll look slightly different based on the information. I think in large, when we look at the overall cost projection, and you quoted one there, Simon, $1.25 in the next 5 years. It's an interesting conversation you need to then have, well, who's taking on that hydrogen and how is it getting there? Because I think you have to look at it across the value chain. We often focus on the production side, but there is the entire value chain that really needs to be looked at, from infrastructure and the customer, what's incentivizing that customer to have that pull. And so we tend to look at it quite broad, and are really working with stakeholders. Governments, I think, have a key role to play, including the private sector, to really tackle this problem collectively together, to really make it a part of that future energy mix.
Okay. Chris, your thoughts on cost of green?
Yeah,
We'll come back to blue.
Yeah, I really agree with Henrik on this one, and what Louise just said. I think what we shouldn't necessarily close out is that there may be places around the world where actually the confluence of those things come together well. So yeah, I tend to agree that here we are in Northern Europe, the costs of renewables, yes, have come down significantly, but there's a limit to how far they can go. But I think in other parts of the world, yes, I think that may be a possibility. And if you're using that hydrogen more locally, then maybe some of those onward costs are a little bit lower. But I guess two things. First of all, you are putting capital on the ground, and if you're relying on renewables and they're running intermittently, then you've got to amortize that capital. Happens over a number of units of energy. So that's one issue, and 100% behind the fact that if you're going to have a functioning hydrogen economy, there is much more than just the production. And so, yeah, I think there may be ways, not preluding a discussion on blue hydrogen, but there may be ways to start to lay some of that infrastructure down to open up that possibility.
That's a natural segue, Chris, into the questions about blue hydrogen. And you're obviously, as you mentioned, involved in the HyNet project in the northwest of England, which is a blue hydrogen to start with project for many players. Tell us about what the balance you see going forward, Chris, between blue and green.
Yeah, no, very happy to. I think the first thing I'd say is actually I'd like to lift it a little bit further than just the colours of blue and green. I think there are a whole range of ways in which hydrogen can be created, low carbon hydrogen. What really matters is that it is low carbon. So yes, obviously natural gas with CCS, so blue hydrogen, electrolytic as we've talked. But of course, again, the assumption that comes from renewables. There could be other sources, linking into nuclear, and whether there are some further efficiency or energy technology integration opportunities that may open. And the other one, and I'm sure we'll pick up this later in the conversation, is that if we can take biogenic resources to hydrogen, and particularly if we then plug those into the CCS infrastructure that blue hydrogen can create, you offer the opportunity to be genuinely taking greenhouse gas reductions from the atmosphere. So I think we need all forms. I think it's really important that we have good standards as to what low carbon hydrogen really means. Here in the UK, there is I'd say that there is a leading position on there. Our UK government is just consulted on a low carbon hydrogen standard, and we certainly have the view that that should be a suitably stringent standard. If we're going to hydrogen, if you don't have a good standard, there's a risk that you're not making the difference that we need to. So we think that's important. So then if you roll forward to kind of 2050, I think taking here in the UK, I think we will see an increasing role for green as we transition. But the important thing is, I think blue hydrogen really helps the beginning of that infrastructure. So number of factors. One, we've all talked about industrials. So industrials need a good, consistent and low-cost source of hydrogen. And I think it's certainly, again, taking the UK as an example, that's much more likely to come from blue in the first instance than green. We do need to establish the distribution and storage infrastructure. And again, if you can get that going with terawatt hours of hydrogen rather than gigawatt hours of hydrogen, you can amortize those costs more easily at the beginning. And fundamentally, and again, it depends where you are in the world, but here in the UK, if you're going to do green today, we don't have the spare renewable electricity to be able to support it. We're not fully we've done very well, but we're not fully decarbonised today. And there are chunks of our energy system that are going to move to electricity. So we run the risk of robbing the renewable electricity for hydrogen and then leaving those other sectors which do need electricity more exposed. So I think there's a real role, and it's a transition.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Of course, the UK's somewhat at odds here, not for the first time, with the rest of Europe, the European Union at least. The European Union is placing all its eggs in the sort of green hydrogen basket. And the UK has said it's blue and green. Henrik, can I pull you in terms of you know, the Equinor view here, the balance between blue and green over time? What's the Equinor view on that?
No, the Equinor view is that we will have both. We will need both, and we're also pursuing both. You know, we have some blue projects, but we're also involved in some quite big green one, like the North H2 in Holland, where together with Shell, RW, and Gasoline is developing a gigawatt green hydrogen facility. So we need both. But it's like Chris is saying, there will be a transition phase. Saying that, I think there are a lot of synergies between developing green and blue in parallel. Synergies in terms of from a project execution point, but also in terms of operation. This, as I view it, is that sometimes electricity prices will be low, probably lower than gas prices. Maybe that's time where you produce green and less blue, and then it will be vice versa. So clearly there are opportunities quite early to start developing green gradually together with blue. But again, blue will be like, as I see it, the main force in developing and initiating these early markets. That's why we justified really the large-scale value chains that we need to develop the hydrogen economy, and that particularly green hydrogen needs, hydrogen storage, hydrogen pipelines, de-risking off-takers. That will be super important.
Okay, so it is blue is a pathway and will help with the transition to green. Louise, do you share that view? Any thoughts from a BP perspective about the balance here?
Yeah, at BP, we think there's a role for both blue and green, and it varies depending where you are in the world. Both the other panelists mentioned, very similar views that we have. The key is to understanding what the ingredients, if you like, that are required for those different blue or green hydrogen. And again, those ingredients are going to be more advantaged in some locations than others. And so for us, it's really around, in these early days, kind of that local story. What is the most cost effective? And in some places, it could be green. And in others, like in the UK, we see blue being able to compete and provide that scale and have that synergy with developing both blue and green in parallel. I think we have such a huge challenge ahead of us in terms of getting to net zero, and we need multiple solutions to get there. And it needs to be cost effective, and we need to do it obviously in a low carbon way. So definitely a role for both.
So just a reminder to our audience, keep pushing your questions into the chat. If you have a violently different view and you think the future's green and we shouldn't be touching blue, we'd love to hear your view. So do please keep putting your questions in to the chat, and we'll try and pick those questions up at the end. Let's turn to carbon capture, which is the other key part of this. If we're convinced there's a role for blue hydrogen. Chris, you mentioned your role in the HyNet project. I mean, how confident are you that CCUS can work at scale? And what are the big barriers you see to making that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, unsurprisingly, I'd say absolutely confident that it can play its role. I mean, fundamentally, it needs to. If we take most economies' energy flows, however well we have all done on renewable electricity, we often find, I mean, if I take the UK as an example, around 80% of our energy flows are still fossil based. And although we've made huge strides, particularly on offshore wind, and some very ambitious targets over the next decade to quadruple our offshore wind capacity, that will still only tickle our overall energy demand. So fossil fuels are going to play a key role. The question is, how do we transition between now and 2050 to use them responsibly and to bring them through? And that's really where CCS comes in. And I'm sure Henrik will talk to us about the experiences that they've had in terms of storing CO2 here in the central North Sea, in the North Sea. It has the capability of doing that. So if I take HyNet as an example, we will be storing, over 1 million tons in the middle of this decade. And by the time we get to the end of the decade, it's 10 million tons per annum. Put that in context with our region, that will be taking over a quarter of the CO2 out of the region that we're in. And in fact, when we link that to hydrogen, we'll be producing nearly a half of the natural gas that would normally be in the region will be replacing with hydrogen. So it becomes really material numbers, and I think we're confident that that's how it will be. But also, and again, we may talk about this later, CCS unlocks negative emissions as well, because you can actually take carbon out of the biosphere by a number of routes and lock it back underground. So I think it's really important. You ask about the barriers. I would be optimistic that it is not a technology barrier. We need well-characterized stores. We need appropriate monitoring system. Capture technology from many sources is actually established. So it's only a case of further refinements, further incremental improvements. It comes back, as Louise said earlier, it's about the business models. And until the cost of carbon is fully internalized into our energy system, there are some bridges that will need to be put in place in order to make that transition, which I'm sure we'll pick up later.
Yeah, no, indeed. And a question's come in the chat about de-risking, which I'm going to come to you, Louise, in just a second on. But Henrik, you're obviously, Equinor's been developing Northern Lights project that you mentioned earlier. It'd be great to hear about the experience of that. And does that give you confidence that CCS can work at scale?
Yes, certainly. And as you know, we have done this for almost 25 years in Norway, storing CO2 underground. And today, I think I can definitely say that Equinor, we consider CCS some part of our normal operation. It's part of our toolbox. We do not consider this as new and novel. It's something we do when we need to do it, so to speak. When it comes to Northern Lights, I think it's also a good example on how to breaking the barriers, because there were a lot of barriers 5 to 6 years ago when CCS was really on almost in the black hole, to say it at least. UK has shut down some projects. It was the last man standing. It was down. I think 3 or 4 years ago, EU was going to vote that CCS should not be part of the climate toolbox. It was so close that CCS was voted out. I think it was UK that came and said, no, you can't do it, and was stopped. Then I think a lot of positive things developed. I think Northern Lights played an instrumental role in that, because we left talking about this is an oil and gas project. This is a one-to-one. We were talking about developing a CO2 store that should be an open access. And we start to work with the European industry, not our oil and gas peers. We were decarbonizing European industry. And I think that somehow moved the needle quite a lot in that politicians certainly view or saw that something, we cannot just electrify everything. The industry needs CCS. And we got the industry voice with us, not the only oil and gas voice. I think that changed a lot. And I think 2 years ago, we presented that we have agreements with 7, let's say, industries storing in Northern Lights. Today, I think we have a list of 60 industries. And I think the final proof that particularly EU had changed, that when the innovation or EU announced that the 4th CCS project was, let's say, made eligible for Innovation Fund, which was really a breakthrough, because CCS in EU was more or less stopped, maybe 10 years ago. So really something important that happened, and this about developing real projects is somehow enabling that and creating that type of open source access. A little bit that we're also trying to do in UK, the BEAT with the Northern Endurance Partnership. It's a store for the industry and for everyone that needs to store CO2. It's not for an exclusive club.
No, thanks, Henrik. That's really interesting to hear your perspectives over the past decade there. Louise, can I pick up on this question that's come through in the chat about what does the government need to do? What are you looking for from government to help move carbon capture and storage ahead? Will you pick that one up?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. So I think before I go directly into what do we need from the government, I think both the panelists, we mentioned a few things that I think it's really important, the momentum that we are seeing today in carbon capture and storage. It's not something new. We BP, like many Equinor, as Henrik said, we've been working with that technology for decades, and we know it is possible. I think some important things, so of course we've got our scenarios and others do as well, but there's a lot of external scenarios too that definitely show CCS as being a pivotal part of getting to that net zero. And the one that I pick up on is the IPC, and it set out scenarios in which deployment of CCS more than halves the cost of limiting that temperature rise to 2 degrees. And I think this is an important conversation to have with maintaining that political and public support for getting to net zero. And so when it comes to specific asks of government, I think, it shows up slightly different depending where you are in the world. But step one is having those conversations and engaging with governments, stakeholders, NGOs on the importance that CCS can bring to delivering that net zero. And it is about, having the right policies, mechanisms, business models, and high standards such that we can demonstrate that CO2 can be stored safely and is vital in order for us to help the planet. And I think, again, I tend to be an optimist, but we are having those conversations. And in the UK with the Northern Endurance Partnership and HyNet and the other clusters, we're all very much sitting at the table together with government to really unlock what is required to get these industries off and going. And then importantly, I think they also need to be sustainable. We want to ensure that they will be part of it. And we're all taxpayers, so we want to use that money very smart and efficiently and develop those business models that over time won't need the support, but we do need that help today to kickstart it. And I think it's more important now than ever to do that. And it's great to see, again, like the US, CCS, DAC, and other technologies have played a high feature in the latest infrastructure bill, which again, I think is a positive in terms of getting this up and going again to support what's required.
Yeah, no, interesting, as you say, that it got referenced in the Biden infrastructure bill. Henrik, you've mentioned a few of the EU innovation projects. Is there anything from an Equinor point of view you're looking for in terms of that? What's the policy framework that makes CCS work in your view?
No, I think there are different types of framework. One example is US with a 45Q. It triggers really development. You see new projects where they're saying, okay, when I build a new ammonia plant, and I'm designing that with 95% capture and storing it because it's economic. So definitely that has an impact. I think also in UK you see developing of specific business model within CO2 transport and storage, within industrial CCS power CCS also are triggering company to invest and use resource in developing projects. So I think that is key. I would say when it comes to EU, they are probably, even though it is positive news, which I think is very positive that they will support it, they still probably don't have the same, let's say, framework as we see in US and UK. They need to establish that. So we need to expect we need to be a little patient also, even though we have these positive news. It takes time to develop these, let's say, framework. I know there are a lot of view on that the EU ETS can drive this, but it might not be the whole story. There might be some, I say, add-ons to make it happen. So that will be key. And I think working with the industry, European industry, I think that's the way to let's say make that let's say go through both on EU level but also on a national level, because it's not. Some is also done in Dutch have their way of doing it. I think they have introduced the SDE Plus, that's the view in renewable, to use that system also within blue hydrogen and CCS. So they also are tailoring their own, let's say, trying to adapt their own systems to address these new type of low carbon value chains. So I think we are on a positive move, so to speak.
And certainly here in the UK, it looks like the government's going to try to replicate some of the experience with offshore wind, with carbon capture in terms of the policy support mechanism. Chris, I'm wondering if I can bring you in on this point, but also maybe invite you to answer the question that came in the chat about the timeframes, because I guess it's all dependent on the policy support, I suppose, in terms of how quickly we can move ahead is somewhat dependent on the policy framework. So maybe in your answer, you could pick up both the question about policy, but also what timeframes do we expect all this, i.e. hydrogen and CCS, to develop over in the UK context?
Brilliant. Yeah, will do, Simon. So I think we should look at what the opportunities are. There is some low-hanging fruit both in the UK and globally. So we've had an oil and gas economy over the last 100 years that has provided assets that are coming to the end of their lives, both in our areas but around the world. And that understanding of geology, those assets that have demonstrably been gas tight over millennia, otherwise there wouldn't have been gas to be found, provides a fantastic platform. And indeed, there are physical assets out there, whether they're fields, whether they're pipelines, that can be reused. So taking HyNet, that's exactly what we're doing. We're taking fields that have been running for the best part of a couple of decades and reusing them. That lowers cost and lowers risk. So I think there's opportunities there. There's also a number of chemical processes that, by virtue of business as usual, separate CO2. So again, whether you're making ammonia or whether you're doing other things, there are already established technologies. So whatever the business models are, I think there's some really early low-hanging fruit that helps take things forward. But what is the role of the business model? And yes, there is a financial role to manage the gap. But I think importantly, there is a chain integration role, which is actually the really unique thing that a government can do. So if I tell you about the UK, we underwent, as Henry said, a competition that didn't end up coming to full fruition at around 2011, 2012. And probably one of the failings of that competition was to place the full chain risk on the private sector and ask the private sector to price that in. And actually, our National Audit Office, when it reviewed that, said actually there is a role for government in handling that integration risk. It is a new market. A chemicals company isn't used to evaluating an offshore asset, and an offshore asset isn't necessarily used to interacting with a power company or a chemicals company, and those risks are different. And I think there's an early stage in an emerging market before there are multiple sources and multiple stores for government to help manage that integration risk. So I think, to add to the other comments, that's actually the thing that I think government can add, because if it does that, then it allows the private sector financing community to bring the capital against which they can then invest, and that's really important. So bringing that round to timescales, I think my first comments highlights that. So I think there are assets coming to the end of their lives round in the central North Sea, and I'm sure elsewhere in the world, which are logically brought together. So the UK government is looking to be operating by the middle of this decade, so 4 or 5 years' time, and we are absolutely in that place. We have over 30 users of the HyNet infrastructure already signed up, over 10 of them to do with CO2 storage, and well over 20 actually getting on for 30 who wish to take the hydrogen. So it's all pent up there, and absolutely right, Simon. It's about getting those business models, not just from policy ideas, but to inked contracts that then we can finally negotiate and get put in place. And that's really going to be the gate, I think, to making progress.
Well, I must confess and declare an interest, because I was in charge of that failed competition when I was in government in 2011, 2012. So I must admit to my mistakes in getting that structure wrong, Chris. Apologies for that. But hopefully we're going to get it right this time. It's going to be third time lucky for CCS in the UK. Let's turn to some other technologies. We've talked quite a lot about hydrogen. We've talked quite a lot about carbon captured storage. I think that you're all conveying a great sense of optimism, and actually it's now as much about the business models to get this going. None of you are saying there's a big technology risk here. Companies like Equinor and BP have been doing this for years, which I think gives us all great encouragement. Can we just bring in some other technologies that you think are going to play a role? I'm not really talking about established technologies like wind and solar here. I'm really thinking about other things. Could I bring you back in, Chris? You mentioned earlier on bioenergy with carbon capture and its potential to produce negative emissions. Could you just say a little bit more about that and why you think that's a significant technology we should be paying attention to?
Absolutely. So I think the general view is that what we're looking for by 2050, and to be quite realistic about it, is a net zero position. I think people recognise, those who are doing the assessments, that to achieve an absolute zero is a challenge if you just look to stop fossil emissions from happening across the entire energy economy. So there are areas where there will inevitably still be fossil emissions, and therefore we have to find ways to offset those. And fundamentally, there's a range of technologies, but that is about taking CO2 from the biosphere and locking it away. And there are different ways of doing that, but certainly I take a strong view that trees have evolved over not just millennia, but longer than that, to be very efficient ways of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. Even though it's 0.04%, they are very good at doing that. So trees and other grown crops. And so I think finding ways of locking that carbon in permanently is important. Clearly, using timber as a construction material that locks it away as part of construction is a really important part of it. But I do think there is a real opportunity to use some of the energy from those resources, but at the same time lock in the CO2. And in its most perfect way, I would say biohydrogen is the pinnacle of that. You are taking a resource, you are converting it to a combination of CO2 and hydrogen, you store the CO2, and then you use the hydrogen with no further emissions at point of use. So I think that's where I think that should play a key role. You get high efficiency and you can achieve that. There are alternative forms of BECCS that may be part of that journey. Clearly, we do combust biomass today, and capturing the CO2 from that when you're making power is one route, and I think we will see that here in the UK. But also sustainable aviation fuels, again, as a transition. Maybe hydrogen does become a big role in that, but that carbon molecule is very good at having high energy density fuels, which are suitable for our current infrastructure. And again, if I convert a biomass to an aviation fuel, inevitably about half of that carbon gets rejected from the process using existing technologies. And actually, why not take that carbon and store it? So hence, that's why I think it has a key role. So.
Okay. I'm going to come to Henrik and Louise in just a second. Can I give you the nuclear question as well, though, that's come through, Chris, because you mentioned nuclear earlier on in the sense of hydrogen production from nuclear power. Do you want to just say why you think that is also a potential viable option?
Sure. First of all, I'll claim this isn't my core area, so I don't want to overplay it. But I think we need to recognise that all low carbon forms of electricity will have a role in that electrolytic based hydrogen. There may well be those opportunities of technical synergies, heat integration and things like that could play a role. And yes, I mean, I think nuclear has a role in our energy systems. I think as we increase the level of renewables that we are using, then finding a role for nuclear which can manage dispatchability economically is important. And there are a couple of ways of doing that. One is that you actually genuinely have an economic and technical solution that can flex. And so, you know, small modular reactors, advanced modular reactors may start to open some of those opportunities. Of course, the other one is to then be flexing the output between electricity and another vector, such as hydrogen. And given the low-cost storage options of hydrogen, that then opens up an opportunity.
Interesting, thank you. Henrik, can I bring you in on direct air capture? It'd be great to hear whether you think direct air capture, another technology that gets talked about a lot, has a significant role to play in getting to net zero.
Yeah, sure. No, and first of all, what Chris says is, I think is super important, is that in all scenarios, I think we recognize we need to do negative emissions. We need to take CO2 out from the atmosphere or for bio and store that to meet the climate targets. So I think that is a fundamental part of that. And also as a nation and even as a company, we have net zero targets, and we will still in 2050 have some residual CO2 unabated fossil. So we also need as a company to have these negative emission solution in our portfolio. And as Chris said, bio is important, but DAC can also play a role. As a chemical engineer, I must say when I heard about DAC first time, I was a little bit skeptical because I knew capturing CO2 from exhaust was very challenging and difficult. And gas power was really, that's the most difficult one because it's very low CO2 concentrations. And then suddenly people talk about from the air where it is 100 times lower CO2 concentration is, in my world, almost found like a mission impossible. But then you see technology develops and clever guys find some new great ideas. And I think the beauty of DAC is that the DAC CO2 is everywhere, right? So you can put it everywhere you want. So you can put it where you have, let's say, the optimum conditions in terms of energy and transport solutions, etc., to make that happen. I think that makes it very attractive. And I really believe it will play an important role, maybe not in the start, maybe when we are closer into approaching 2050, maybe from the mid-2030s, we're talking about more, let's say, deployment of DAC at large scale. I think there's still a need for some technology improvements and development. Costs are high, energy consumption are high, that needs to go down. But saying that, I think if we want to meet net zero, we need to remove the last CO2 molecule, and that last CO2 molecule will cost some money. So also something we might have to accept when we are approaching 2050. So I think that really offers some very unique, let's say, additions to our low carbon toolbox, where we can more or less play more with the locations and also the broader concept. I would also say, just to add on, because it's a lot about DAC and BECCS, but I also say blue hydrogen facility offers some negative emissions opportunity. Like Chris said, you can feed in biogas and bio sources into the process. So you almost from day one can get some kind of negative emissions as part of the blue hydrogen production. I think that offers some add-ons. And in Germany, where they talk a lot about importing, not only hydrogen, but also synthetic gases produced maybe by DAC in Sahara and somewhere, we can in fact use the blue hydrogen plants to convert synthetic renewable gases into, call it then green hydrogen, but based on the blue hydrogen technology. So I think there are a lot of interesting options in that negative emissions area, to say it like that.
Mm. No, very, very interesting. Louise, can I bring you in? Your thoughts on DAC, BECCS, and indeed any other low carbon technologies you think might have a role?
I think Chris and Hendrik really covered it well. I think what I will add is all of these technologies, these are the ones that are less mature, aren't at scale, and are really important to decarbonizing. We've talked about that, the hard to abate industrial sector, heavy duty transportation, longer term, include marine and aviation in there as well. And all of these technologies coming together really offer an opportunity for what we're starting to see emerge are these clean energy hubs. If you have a system like the Northern Endurance Partnership in northeast of England in Teesside, you have your transport and storage to be able to capture and store that CO2. You can put hydrogen in there, blue and green. You support the industrial area that are going to need those tools over time to decarbonize, and you can throw other technologies in there, and you have this ecosystem that you're starting to develop that not only decarbonizes the planet, but brings other great things like jobs and just you're creating that new sector for communities that tend to be located in those high industrial areas that are going to need these technologies that don't exist in scale today. And so for BP and for, I personally think just we need all these different technologies. And it's great to see that these hubs are starting to form that can really start to unlock and over time scale to support these industries that we need to decarbonize.
Which brings us on to this question that's gone in the chat from one of our audience about the difference of hard to abate sectors. You've mentioned there, Louise, some of the industry sectors where we're going to need to use hydrogen and carbon capture. We've talked a little bit about transport. Obviously, hydrogen may well have a role in power generation going forward as well. But the questioner is saying there are hard to abate sectors and there are hard to abate countries, and then goes on to say, isn't coal return a premature strategy for developing countries? Does anybody want to come in on that point? I think it's getting at the fact that the sort of transition has to be a fair one, and is it too early to retire coal out of the energy mix for developing countries? Does anybody want to come in on that point, given all this optimism you're sharing about negative emissions in developed countries?
Go on, then I'll say a few things. Because I don't have big oil companies behind me, so I can sort of be maybe a little more open. Look, fundamentally, we need to transition to low carbon. You're right, it needs to be just. Coal itself clearly has a very high carbon intensity. That said, if we can apply CCS and took coal to make it to make to hydrogen, it is another very legitimate fuel source that could go in. And in reality, if you gasify and then you work through the chemistry and then take the CO2 out, you should get to reasonably high levels of abatement. I think the thing I'd be a little nervous about is the upstream emissions. And I think that's quite important to consider when it comes to coal. So I think there could be a way in which it has a role, but I think I'm more interested in thinking what are the vectors that help countries to decarbonize. So both electricity and hydrogen, providing they are low carbon vectors, then I think doing whatever we can to actually enable those, and whether it is distributed renewables or other solutions, I think they're all important.
Excellent. Go on, Oce.
Yeah, I was just going to add something. I think one of the key things that Chris mentioned is, the energy transition is absolutely, it needs to happen, and it does need to happen in a just way. And I think, from BP's perspective, being an international oil company transitioning to an integrated energy company, one of the things that, we operate around the globe, and we've been able to develop energy systems to parts of the world and bringing heat, light, and mobility to communities that had none. And I think we have an important role to play in this transition and support those different parts of the world with what are those, right, as Chris said, what are those rights vectors. I think we're going to see some instances where, you can go straight from coal to renewable power. And it just really is about working together with stakeholders and thinking about how it can be done in the most just and cost effective and low carbon way as possible. And it's not a one size fits all.
Right, thank you. One of the other questions that's come through in the chat here is about the role in storage. And let's just talk about the role that hydrogen could play specifically as a storage vector. I don't know if anybody wants to come in on that point. Chris, you did touch on this earlier in your earlier answer. Do you want to elaborate a little bit about how big a role hydrogen could play as a storage vector?
Yeah, I think one of the things about the fossil fuel industry is it has given us latency in our energy systems that allows us to buffer in a good way. I mean, even a gas system, even if you don't have stores on the end, you've got pipelines with line pack that allow that. And I think we often underestimate the value that brings to our energy system. And the joy of moving to hydrogen is that you retain that option. So again, if I use HyNet as an example, even in our kind of first phase during this decade, we will be having 1.3 terawatt hours of hydrogen storage integrated into our infrastructure. And that allows us to handle users of power production from hydrogen that are dispatchable to match when the wind isn't blowing, the sun isn't shining. It gives a very rapid and instantaneous supply of hydrogen to fulfill that, while the core hydrogen plants can operate at base load with good amortization of their costs and things like that. So I think hydrogen storage has a real role. Hydrogen storage in salt caverns is done around the world today. So again, not a technical risk. I think that's important. I think longer term, establishing whether there are other geological formations that are suitable for hydrogen storage is important. But clearly, we need to make sure that it is all, it is properly capped and works well. We know salt works. I think there could be others, and I think there is early work looking at alternative stores as well. I think will be important longer term.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. I'm very conscious that we're almost up at time, and I'm going to ask our panel for some final reflections and remarks. I would like to ask in that context about, how far can technology breakthroughs really take us on net zero? And, can we just rely on technology? I think a number of politicians and governments around the world really hoping that your optimism is well-founded and that technology can get us almost all the way so they don't have to get the public to change any behaviours. But how far is that really true? And so I'm going to come to each of you, but let me just try and capture some key points before I do give you the final word. Tremendous optimism from all of you about both green hydrogen, blue hydrogen and carbon capture. Henrik, you made a really interesting point earlier about the costs of green hydrogen being heavily dependent on that cost of electricity. All of you are saying there's a role for blue and green, and it starts with blue and it'll move to green hydrogen over time, and that we need good standards for that low carbon hydrogen. Great to hear the experience of Equinor and BP that CCS is not new. It's established technology in many ways. It's all about the business models and policy framework. I think, Louise, you made that point very clearly at the start. And all of you pointing out the important role that negative emission technologies are going to play. So DAC, BECCS, and indeed other technologies. So those are some of the key takeaways I've noted down from this session. But final word to each of you. We'll go in reverse order. So Chris, then Henrik, and then Louise. Chris, just to you, final thoughts.
I think when you talk about behaviour change, it's really important. And rather than make the distinction between behaviour and technology, I'd like to make the distinction between behavioural change and system change. And I think what we've talked about today underpins a system change, an infrastructure change. And I think where we can change infrastructure and systems, we can make it easier for consumers to reduce their carbon. But importantly, give it a permanence in its reduction as well. Some of the challenges with behaviour change is that other things can happen and other priorities come into people's lives. If we decarbonise the energy that arrives at people's homes, then actually that locks that in permanently. And hence, I think there's a real importance in what we've talked about today.
Thanks, Chris. Henrik?
Sure. I think at least in the next 10 to 15 years, maybe even 20, we can use already existing technology. CCS exists, blue hydrogen technology, even green hydrogen technology have been existing for 50, 60 years. So it's not a technology issue. A lot of things we discussed today we could have done 20 years ago. So I think really it's about policymakers, and just to bring up the Chris points, I think we need to take some policymakers need to take some really bold decisions. And maybe some decisions they haven't really taken for the last 20, 30, 40 years. That time they had to take some decision. We convert from town's gas to natural gas. Some of these decisions they need to take today to make this transition into CCS and hydrogen. Over-investing or pre-investing in CO2 transport infrastructure, because we're not building that for just one problem, we're building that for the future. The same goes for hydrogen. I think that is really where we need some, let's say, maybe behavioral changes. We need to get back to the 50-60 mindset of policymakers.
Old policy, I like that, Henrik. And Louise, final word to you.
Thank you. I mean, I think, to put it kind of a personal perspective on this a little bit, I think, yes, there is the technology plays a role, private sector plays a role, governments play a role, communities play a role. And for me, I think the important thing is the momentum that we're seeing. I have a 10-year-old son, and what he's learning in school about energy transition and what's required is just, it's fascinating to see. And it's on warp speed every day. It's changing. You hear more and more about it. So I think we have all the right ingredients. It's now just everyone coming together to really kind of roll up the sleeves and tackle this really complex problem. If it was easy, we would have done it already. And so we need all hands on deck to really take this forward.
That's a good message to end on. So look, that's all we got time for today. Been a fascinating discussion. Big thank you to Louise, to Henrik, and to Chris. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. Thanks everybody for joining, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Enrich actually started originally as a knowledge sharing platform.
Great. When you come and visit a digital lounge, you want to be wowed. You want to see the wow factor. And this is what this lounge is doing. It is showcasing the best that KPMG has got in terms of developing solutions, working with alliance partners, and importantly, showing how these solutions are going to bring outcomes for clients.
Enrich 2020 is a global edition of our annual event, and indeed we have changed with times, and in this new normal it's my pleasure to welcome you again.
Welcome to the session on defining alternative pathways through ESG investment.
And a very warm welcome to this session of the Enrich conference.
This panel is beyond the horizon, new energy technologies, and their relevance to Asia Pacific.
Today in this session, we are going to talk about the MENA region.
I have the privilege of hosting the panel.
Welcome to this panel session on getting close to the customer. Can the majors win this game?
Keeping up with the new normal, Enrich is being held virtually this year.
What better way to experience digital possibilities but on a digital platform?
Enrich actually started originally as a knowledge sharing platform